Aphasia means that you have a language disorder that could make it hard for you to read, listen, write, and say what you mean to say due to a cerebral lesion. The most common cause is stroke, although it could also be due to traumatic brain injury, brain tumors, among other causes. There are many types of aphasia, which vary greatly in their symptoms, depending on the location of the injury. In this video, we're going to explain each type of classical aphasia with examples. Let's start with Broca's aphasia. Broca's aphasia is classically associated with a lesion in Broca's area, which corresponds to Brodmann's areas 44 and 45. Although Broca's area is more complex than what was presumed and usually taught, which I explained in detail in this video. In the case of Broca's aphasia, is classified as a non-fluent aphasia, which means that the output of spontaneous speech is markedly diminished. Agrammatism is also a common feature, a deficit in formulating and processing syntax. Concerning language production, whether written or spoken, people with Broca's aphasia tend to produce short and simple phrases and avoid complex grammatical constructions, which is called telegraphic speech. This term originates from the era when people used telegraphs, where they had to pay for every word and therefore used only essential words to convey their message. They often omit function words such as prepositions, pronouns, determiners, conjunctions, and auxiliary verbs. The words they speak or write tend to be content words, primarily nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. For example, instead of saying the glass is on the table, they might say glass table. Additionally, verbs in English are often used without inflection. For example, they may say I go instead of I went. Although it is frequently stated in some places that comprehension remains intact, it is indeed impaired, although less severely than in other forms of aphasia. Comprehension is particularly impaired for more complex grammatical structures. An example of this is reversible passives, which could be harder to understand. If I say, Bob was kissed by Mary, a person with Broca's aphasia is going to have trouble understanding because they don't know who did the kissing and who got kissed. This is because it would make logical sense for either subject to do the kissing. In contrast, a passive sentence such as, the ball was kicked by Ben, is not reversible. A ball cannot kick a person and would be relatively easy for a person with Broca's aphasia to understand. This applies whether it's listened to or read. It is believed that this is due to the fact that people with Broca's aphasia have impaired working memory and processing speed. This reduced capacity leads to challenges in handling incoming information at the rate necessary for understanding. Similar issues occur with their speech production, although it's important to mention that there are more theories explaining why agrammatism exists. People with Broca's aphasia have dysnomia, which means they have difficulty evoking the words they want to express. This is a problem in all aphasias. This difficulty is often expressed through circumlocutions, which means they use an indirect way of saying something. For example, instead of saying, give me the scissors when they can't recall the word scissors, they might say, give me the thing that you can cut. They also experience phonemic paraphasias. For example, instead of saying vegetable, they might say tegetable. Less frequently, they exhibit semantic paraphasias. For instance, instead of saying cutters, they might say scissors. Their speech tends to be effortful, and they tend to be aware of their errors, especially in contrast to people with Wernicke's aphasia. Some experience extreme frustration when struggling to communicate. Long pauses between words are common, and words may be produced one syllable at a time. Their prosody and intonation are compromised by the shortened length of utterances and the presence of self-repairs and disfluencies. Next, we have Wernicke's aphasia. Wernicke's aphasia is classically associated with a lesion in Wernicke's area, which corresponds to Brodmann area 22. Though Wernicke's area is more complex than what was previously presumed and usually taught. In the case of Wernicke's aphasia, it is classified as a fluent aphasia, which means that people can speak or write readily, even though some of the words they produce are incorrect or don't make any sense. They also tend to have more difficulty understanding language. Also, they talk a lot, even though it's hard to understand what they're saying. It is even sometimes called jargon aphasia because they produce non-words, or neologisms, which means they create new words. An example is saying, bring me a trunket, instead of, bring me a drink. They may have logorrhea, or overly fluent speech. It's as if they're driven by an urgent need to say everything at once, speaking faster than average but maintaining their prosody. They usually continue to speak even when the listener is showing signs they're not understanding, and do not adhere to social conventions about turn-taking. Unlike people with Broca's aphasia who tend to be very aware of their problems, people with Wernicke's aphasia tend to lack awareness of their deficits. Another difference is that they preserve their grammar well. In contrast with people with Broca's aphasia, people with Wernicke's aphasia use many functional words like auxiliary verbs, conjunctions, and prepositions. However, what they're saying lacks meaning because they fail to correctly use content words like nouns. For example, did you tapo the? In this case, words like did, you, and the are functional words that are preserved and correctly used. In contrast, content words are affected. The first one should be a verb but is replaced with a noun-word, and the last one should be a noun but nothing was said instead. Additionally, people with Wernicke's aphasia produce a lot of paraphasias. This error can occur in many different ways. In the case of Wernicke's aphasia, semantic and phonemic paraphasias are common. Another notable characteristic is the presence of perseveration or perseverative paraphasias. This means that a previous response persists and interferes with the retrieval of a new one. For example, when asked to name body parts, a person might correctly name arm but then repeat the word arm when the clinician points to an ear. Regarding comprehension, in the most severe and early stages, individuals may fail to understand even single words. However, as therapy progresses and the person gets better, their auditory comprehension improves, allowing them to understand words although they still struggle with more complex sentences. In addition to comprehension difficulties, their repetition is affected in a very curious way. They often make many paraphasias and neologisms, similar to their spontaneous speech. More interestingly, they might add a word or phrase or use a more complex form than the one given, a phenomenon known as expansion. They also experience difficulties with automatic language. Automatic language refers to words, phrases, and expressions that a person can produce almost unconsciously and effortlessly, such as counting, reciting the days of the week, naming the months of the year, or reciting the alphabet. Although if they receive help, they can produce automatic language. For example, if it's a series of numbers, the examiner can give an initial prompt, such as counting 1, 2, 3, and the patient can continue by saying 4, 5, 6. If this video is useful, please subscribe for more content. Third, conduction aphasia. Conduction aphasia was traditionally thought to be caused by a lesion in the arcuate fasciculus, a white matter tract that connects Broca's and Wernicke's areas, basically connecting the two main language centers of the brain in the left hemisphere. For this reason is considered a disconnection syndrome, but this hypothesis has been challenged because the evidence shows that is not just the result of a damage to the arcuate fasciculus. Cortical lesions alone may produce conduction aphasia, specifically damage to the left superior temporal gyrus and/or the left supramarginal gyrus. Furthermore, lesions to the arcuate fasciculus do not always cause conduction aphasia. We must be very careful with the diagnosis of this aphasia. In most cases, it is considered a fluent aphasia. However, sometimes it may be thought to be non-fluent because the person makes many self-corrections, leading them to say fewer words per minute, which may cause the speech-language therapist to mistake it for Broca's aphasia. It can also sometimes be confused with anomic aphasia, whose hallmark feature is word-finding difficulty, but with very well-preserved comprehension. Both conditions share this latter trait. Nevertheless, this aphasia has unique characteristics that can help differentiate it from other types of aphasia. The main feature of conduction aphasia is impaired repetition. The longer and more complex the words, phrases, and sentences, the more difficulty they have with the task. It's also more challenging if they're asked to repeat non-words. Despite this significant difficulty with repetition, they can still read, write, and speak relatively fluently, and they are able to understand what others say. What makes it very different from other types of aphasia is that, whether in repetition or spontaneous speech, they often fail to say a word correctly by changing some of its sounds. This is called phonemic paraphasia. Although this phenomenon occurs in other types of aphasia, what makes it particularly interesting is that they simultaneously make repeated attempts at self-correction because they are aware of their errors, a behavior known as conduite approach. For example, if asked to say refrigerator, the patient might say frigilator, no, frigilator, until they eventually say the word correctly. In addition, some individuals may also have dysnomia, which means struggling with word-finding skills. Fourth, anomic aphasia. Anomic aphasia is traditionally linked to lesions in the angular gyrus, though other affected areas have been reported. These are usually located near the intersection of the superior temporal and inferior parietal lobes. This damage results in the following symptoms. As its name implies, the hallmark feature of anomic aphasia is anomia. Anomia means that a person has difficulty evoking the words they want to express, which can also manifest in writing. But all aphasias have at some degree anomia. What's the difference? The key difference from other aphasias is that in anomic aphasia other aspects of language are relatively preserved. They can be very fluent, use proper syntax, and have relatively intact comprehension. And despite this, they still experience significant anomia. This anomia is often expressed through circumlocutions, which means they use an indirect way of saying something. These circumlocutions can sound odd due to their vagueness, often using generic terms like thing or fillers such as, you know. Their oral comprehension is practically intact although they struggle with tasks of high complexity. Reading and writing abilities can vary widely from one patient to another, depending on the location and extent of the causal lesion. Some individuals may read at functional levels. However, due to the lesion site, it is also very common to find alexia with agraphia, meaning they experience significant difficulties when reading and writing. Fifth, global aphasia. It all began when a neurologist fascinated by the brain had a patient named Louis Victor Leborgne, known to everyone as Tan. Tan was a mystery. He couldn't speak, except for one word, Tan. No matter the question, no matter the situation, Tan was all he could say. This marked the beginning of the discovery of what is now known as global aphasia. In the case of global aphasia, the lesion tends to be very large and located in the left hemisphere, including anterior and posterior zones related to language. This region is called the parasylvian zone, which includes Broca's and Wernicke's areas. However, it's not always the case, since in very rare cases it can be caused by a subcortical lesion. This lesion generally includes all of the following subcortical structures simultaneously: the putamen, the posterior limb of the internal capsule, the temporal isthmus, and periventricular white matter. This leads to cortical hypoperfusion in the parasylvian language areas. If the lesion is caused by a stroke, it typically involves an occlusion of the internal carotid artery or middle cerebral artery, affecting both the inferior and superior divisions, resulting in a large wedge-shaped damaged area of 2/3 or more of the left hemisphere. This type of lesion leads to distinctive characteristics that help differentiate global aphasia from other types of aphasia. Global aphasia is the most severe form of aphasia, because it entails a combination of expressive and receptive language deficits across all modalities. This means it impacts language production whether spoken or written, as well as comprehension whether spoken or written. It's so severe that sometimes people are unable to speak at all, especially soon after the lesion. This is called mutism. This contrasts with fluent aphasias, such as Wernicke's aphasia, where individuals may produce a large number of words. Others speak only through stereotypes. This refers to the repetition of the same single word or non-word, regardless of the intended meaning. For example, a person may say only hello in any verbal context. This was the case of Tan. He only said tan to everything. So, communication is primarily carried out through gestures, intonation, and facial expressions. They are able to do this because the functionality of the right hemisphere remains intact, which is the main center for processing context, emotionality, and the social aspects of language. As I said, comprehension is severely affected. Most patients do not understand anything at all. This includes single words, sentences, and conversations. This contrasts with aphasias such as anomic or conduction aphasia, where individuals have relatively preserved comprehension abilities. However, in a few cases, their comprehension is a bit better if it's a conversation about topics related to the patient. They may be able to answer yes or no correctly in response to questions about their family members, illness, or recent personal events. It has also been reported that some of these patients, despite their severely overall comprehension deficits, have a remarkably well-preserved ability to recognize the names of geographic locations and identify them on a map. The aphasia most similar to global aphasia is mixed transcortical aphasia, as both severely impair language comprehension and production. However, individuals with mixed transcortical aphasia can repeat words and phrases remarkably well, whereas those with global aphasia cannot. Sixth, transcortical sensory aphasia. This type of aphasia is classically associated with a lesion near Wernicke's area, though Wernicke's area itself remains unaffected. Most of the time, Brodmann areas 3, 7, and 39 are involved. One of their symptoms is that they can be very fluent, even though it's hard to understand what they're saying, because they produce a lot of paraphasias. In this case, semantic, phonemic and neologistics paraphasias are common. Regarding comprehension, something very similar to what is observed in Wernicke's aphasia occurs. Patients exhibit significant difficulties at the word, sentence, and discourse levels, although the latter may be less affected. The main difference between this aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia lies in repetition skills. In Wernicke's aphasia, patients have significant difficulty repeating words and sentences. In contrast, individuals with transcortical sensory aphasia have well-preserved repetition abilities. In fact, they often exhibit echolalia, an involuntary and meaningless repetition of words just spoken by another person. Seventh, transcortical motor aphasia. In this case, if the cause is a stroke, it is often due to an occlusion of the anterior cerebral artery, which affects the anterior watershed area of the left frontal lobe, extending to the prefrontal regions. It has indeed been associated with lesions in Brodmann's areas 6, 8, 9, 10, and 46. Is classified as a non-fluent aphasia, which means that the output of spontaneous speech is markedly diminished. For this same reason, and because it shares many other characteristics, it is often confused with Broca's aphasia. Don't worry if you confuse them, we're going to discuss how they are similar and how they differ. First, their similarities. In this aphasia, just like in Broca's, it is common to find agrammatism, a deficit in formulating and processing syntax. Concerning language production, whether written or spoken, people with Broca's aphasia tend to produce short and simple phrases and avoid complex grammatical constructions, which is called telegraphic speech. Although most of their comprehension remains intact, it is indeed impaired, although less severely than in other forms of aphasia. Comprehension is particularly impaired for more complex grammatical structures. An example of this is reversible passives, which could be harder to understand. They also have anomia, which means they have difficulty evoking the words they want to express. This difficulty is found mainly in their spontaneous speech, often expressed through phonemic paraphasias. Less frequently, they exhibit semantic paraphasias. Another notable characteristic is the presence of perseveration or perseverative paraphasias. This means that a previous response persists and interferes with the retrieval of a new one. Now, the differences. These individuals also exhibit good repetition skills, and they can repeat long, complex phrases effortlessly and without error, even in their syntax. This differs significantly from what happens with their spontaneous speech and from Broca's aphasia, which is characterized by poor repetition skills. In fact, their good repetition skills have a dark side and are often expressed as echolalia. Additionally, they are typically poor conversational partners. They have deficits in initiating and maintaining conversations, which results in reduced speech output. A person may seldom produce utterances and typically remain silent. The utterances they do produce are usually only 1 to 2 words long. However, in more structured and predictable interactions, they tend to respond more fluently and promptly. A structured interaction could be something that can be answered with a factual, one-word response. For example, when asked, "What happened that brought you to the hospital?" the patient would typically appear blocked, struggling with fragments such as "I was," "I can't." In contrast, they can respond quickly if asked to state the name of the place where they were born, the name of their occupation, or the names of objects presented visually. 8th. Mixed transcortical aphasia. In this case, the lesion is typically very large and located in the left hemisphere, involving both anterior and posterior regions near key language centers such as Broca's area, responsible for language production, and Wernicke's area, also important in language. However, the damage does not directly affect those areas. Instead, the lesion functionally isolates them from the rest of the brain, which can manifest in a variety of ways. The first characteristic is that it's a severe form of aphasia, because it entails a combination of expressive and receptive language deficits across all modalities. This means it impacts language production whether spoken or written, as well as comprehension whether spoken or written. As you can see, this aphasia is very similar to global aphasia, but they're very different in a crucial aspect that we're going to discuss later. This type of aphasia can also be referred to as isolation aphasia, and is the least common of the 3 transcortical aphasias. It's estimated to account for only 3% of all cases. As I said, comprehension is severely affected. Most patients do not understand anything at all. This includes single words, sentences, and conversations. This contrasts with aphasias such as anomic or conduction aphasia, where individuals have relatively preserved comprehension abilities. As I mentioned at the beginning, the aphasia most similar to mixed transcortical aphasia is global aphasia, as both severely impair language comprehension and production. However, individuals with mixed transcortical aphasia, although they can't even name simple objects, are still able to repeat words and phrases remarkably well, whereas those with global aphasia cannot. In fact, their good repetition skills have a dark side and are often expressed as echolalia, which can manifest in a variety of ways. Such as if the examiner says the first few words of familiar songs or rhymes, these patients often complete the phrase and may go on to provide one or more following lines. Here's an example of how a conversation with someone with this type of aphasia might go.
Hello, Mrs. Smith.
Mrs. Smith, yes.
How are you doing today?
How are you doing today?
I'm very fine, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm very fine, thank you.
My name is Bill. I'll be working with you today.
My name is Bill. I'm working today.